Didn't say a word when my son-in-law's mother walked into my granddaughter's birthday party and rearranged the seating so I was placed at the children's table. I smiled, picked up a paper crown, and put it on. My daughter caught my eye from across the room. I shook my head almost imperceptibly. Not today. Not here. That was 14 months ago. I should start further back. My name is Lenora Fitch. I am 63 years old. I have one daughter, Willa, who is 31, and two grandchildren. A boy named Scout, who is 7, and a girl named Poppy, who just turned 5. I spent 31 years as a licensed commercial appraiser. And before I retired, I owned the firm I built from a single-room office above a dry cleaner on Caldwell Street. I say all of this not to brag. I say it because none of it seemed to matter the moment my daughter married into the Drexler family. Willa met her husband, Owen Drexler, at a conference in Atlanta when she was 26. He was smart and funny, and she told me over the phone that night, the first man in years who had actually listened to her. I was happy for her. I flew down that spring to meet him. He was polite, he helped clear the table, and when he shook my hand, his grip was firm and his eyes were steady. I thought, this one is solid. I did not think about his mother. I should have. Rosalie Drexler was 61 when I first met her, a woman who wore her silver hair in a precise chignon and had a habit of finishing other people's sentences before they could get to the point. She had been a school principal for 22 years, and she carried that authority like a garment she never took off. Not even at the dinner table. Not even at a wedding. Not even when she was technically a guest in someone else's home. She arrived at my house for Thanksgiving the year after Willa and Owen got engaged, walked through my front door, looked around my living room, and said, "Oh, you've done a lot with a modest space." I offered her coffee. She said she didn't drink coffee afternoon. It was 11:47. I want to be fair to her. In the early years, she wasn't cruel. She was merely persistent. She had opinions about where Willa and Owen should live, which were not opinions she stated directly, but rather references she made, often to the schools in her neighborhood, to the safety of her neighborhood, to how lovely it would be to have family nearby. Owen was her only child. I understood that. I tried to understand that. When Scout was born, she arrived at the hospital before I did because she lived closer and she was holding him when I walked into the room. Willa looked at me over her shoulder and mouthed, "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "It's fine. It was fine." It stopped being fine the year Willa was promoted. She had been working in contract compliance at a mid-sized logistics company for 4 years when a senior director position opened up. She applied. She got it. The salary nearly doubled. She was proud, rightfully. And when she called to tell me, she was laughing in a way I hadn't heard since she was in college. I sat in my kitchen and listened to her laugh, and I thought, this is what you work for. This moment. Hearing your child happy. Rosalie did not see it that way. I found out later from Owen that she had called him the night Willa got the news. He told me this months after everything fell apart, when he was trying to explain himself, when he was trying to apologize. His mother had called him and said that she was worried, that Willa was going to be working long hours, that the children needed stability, that she hoped Owen wasn't going to become one of those men who let their wife's career come first while the household suffered. She didn't say any of this once. She said it over several weeks, in variations each time framed as concern, each time deniable as anything other than love. Owen is not a bad man. I believe that. He is a man who was raised by a woman who knew exactly which pressure points to press, and he had 40 years of practice being pressed. The first thing that happened was small. Willa mentioned that Owen had started commenting on the house. Little things. The laundry, the dinner timing, whether Poppy's hair was brushed before school. Willa said it felt like he was keeping score of something, though she couldn't say of what. She laughed it off. I didn't laugh it off. I filed it. The second thing was not small. In November of last year, someone contacted Willa's HR department with an anonymous complaint. The complaint alleged that Willa had been falsifying her expense reports. It included screenshots. It included dates. It included enough specific detail that HR was required by policy to open a formal investigation. The investigation took 6 weeks. Willa called me the night it began. She wasn't crying. She was very, very still in the way that people get when they're trying to keep themselves from coming apart. She said, "Mom, I didn't do this." I said, "I know." She said, "Owen thinks I need to get ahead of it, maybe step down until it's resolved." I said, "Don't step down." She said, "He says it's the professional thing to do." I said, "Willa, do not step down." She didn't step down. She didn't step down. She was suspended with pay while the investigation ran. The suspension itself was not technically public, but in a company of 300 people, a senior director who disappears from meetings for 6 weeks is noticed. She told me that people stopped texting her back. A woman she had considered a work friend sent a brief message that said only, "I heard. I'm so sorry it came to this," as if it were a verdict already. I drove to her house that first weekend. She was sitting at her kitchen counter with her laptop open and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Owen was at his mother's. He had said, getting the kids out of the house so Willow could have space to think. This seemed thoughtful on the surface. It was not thoughtful. He had been at his mother's house a great deal in those 6 weeks. I sat down across from her and I said, "Tell me everything." She did. The screenshots had been sent from an email address that looked almost exactly like hers. One letter different. The dates in the falsified reports corresponded to weeks she had actually submitted expenses, which meant whoever billed the forgery had access to her real records, or at minimum to her general schedule. The amounts were plausible. That was the detail that disturbed her most. Whoever had done this knew her well enough to make it believable. I asked her who had access to her expense records. She said her assistant, her direct manager, and anyone with administrative rights in their system. I asked if Owen had ever used her work laptop. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Mom," I said, "I'm not accusing Owen. I'm asking who had access." She said he had used it once, maybe twice, to check something when his own laptop was charging. She said Rosalie had visited their house in October and spent an afternoon there while Willow was at work. She said the laptop had been in her home office. I did not say what I was thinking. I asked if she had a personal attorney. She said they'd been using the family lawyer, a man named Gerald. And then she stopped. Gerald Whitmore had been the Drexler family attorney for 20 years. He had handled their wills, their property, their corporate filings. He was not, Willa said slowly, quite catching up to what I had already understood. Her attorney. He was Owen's attorney. He was Rosalie's attorney. I said, "I'm going to make some calls. I want to explain something about the work I did for 31 years. Commercial appraisal is, at its core, research. You learn to read documents. You learn to trace ownership, history, discrepancy. You learn that what is on the surface is often not what is underneath, and that the distance between those two things is exactly where the truth lives. I had spent 3 decades being paid to find that distance. I also want to explain something about Rosalie Drexler that I had known for 4 years and never said aloud to anyone. She owned properties. Not as an LLC, not under a corporation. Directly, personally, under her own name. I knew this because shortly after Willa and Owen got engaged, I did what any appraiser with 30 years of experience and access to public records would do. I looked. 3 residential rentals in the county. 1 mixed-use building on Fenner Avenue that she had inherited from her own father and held for 19 years. The building on Fenner Avenue. I had appraised that block professionally in 2019 as part of a commercial corridor study commissioned by the City Planning Office. I knew every property on Fenner Avenue. I knew their histories, their assessed values, their ownership chains, their liens. What I also knew, and what I had never had reason to say, was that the mixed-use building Rosalie Drexler had held for 19 years was currently under negotiation for a block acquisition by a development group that would, if the deal closed, make her approximately $1.4 million above assessed value. I knew the development group's primary contact. His name was Aldous Fenn, and I had appraised his firm's acquisitions in that corridor. He owed me nothing. But he remembered me, and when I called him that Tuesday morning and said I had some questions about a property he was negotiating, he took the call. I asked him one question: had the owner of the Fenner Avenue building made the acquisition contingent on anything? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Lenora, I can't discuss the specifics of an ongoing negotiation." I said, "I understand. I'm not asking for specifics. I'm asking if there are conditions." He said, "There are always conditions." I thanked him and hung up. The investigation into Willa concluded in the 5th week. The IT forensics team hired by our company traced the email address to an account created on a public library computer 14 miles from Willa's house. The account had been used exactly once to send that single complaint, and then never again. The metadata on the falsified screenshots showed they had been created on a device that was not Willa's work laptop, not her home computer. They had been created on a tablet. Willa was cleared. Full reinstatement. A letter in her file explicitly noting the complaint had been found to be fabricated. She called me the night she got the news. This time she was crying, that specific kind of crying that isn't grief but the release of something you've been holding so tightly for so long that when it finally loosens your whole body doesn't know what to do with itself. I listened to her cry and I didn't say I told you so. And I didn't say now, do you see, because she was my daughter and that was not what she needed. What I said was, what is Owen saying? She said he was relieved. He was very glad it was over. He hoped they could move forward. I said, Willa, Someone created a false identity and fabricated documents to end your career. That person knew your expense schedule, had access to detailed information about your work, and used a tablet. Does Owen know whose tablet it was? She was quiet. I said, has he asked? She said, he says we should let the company handle it. I said, the company found you innocent. They're not investigating the source of the complaint. That's not their job. She said, Mom, I can't. I don't want to believe. I said, I know. I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm asking you to be careful. 2 weeks later, Owen told her he thought they needed a trial separation. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said the stress of the past months had clarified some things for him. He said it in a very even, reasonable voice, the way someone says a thing they have rehearsed. He had already spoken to Gerald Whitmore. He had already identified a mediator. He had already, Willa later found out, changed the password on their joint savings account 3 days earlier. She called me from the driveway of their house at 8 in the morning. Scout and Poppy buckled in the back seat on her way to drop them at school. She didn't say anything at first. I heard her breathing. I heard Poppy ask why they weren't moving yet. I said, drive the kids to school, then come here. She came. She sat at my kitchen counter in the same spot she'd sat months before, and I made her eggs, and I didn't say anything unnecessary, and after she ate I said, I need to tell you some things I probably should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't. I told her about the Fenner Avenue building. I told her about the development deal. I told her what I believed had happened carefully, the way you lay out evidence. Not accusations, evidence. I told her that I thought Rosalie had made a calculation, that if Willa lost her job, or lost her reputation, or left the marriage under a cloud of suspicion, the separation settlement would favor Owen, and by extension Rosalie's influence over him and those grandchildren would be permanent. I told her that I thought the changed savings account password was not a coincidence. Willa listened to all of it without speaking. When I finished, she said, can you prove any of this? I said, not yet. She said, what do you mean not yet? I said, I mean I'd made some inquiries and I'm waiting on a few things. What I was waiting on, I had contacted a former colleague who now worked in real estate litigation. I had asked her, professionally, to review the Fenner Avenue acquisition documentation and tell me whether there were any conditions attached to the sale that were unusual. She had come back to me 2 days earlier and said there was a clause, a private clause, not publicly recorded, conditioning the final close on the seller having resolved certain, quote, family legal matters to her satisfaction by a specific date. The date was 4 months out. I looked at that date, and I thought about the timing of everything. The complaint, the investigation, the suspension, the separation. Everything had been designed to land Willa in a divorce proceeding before that date. A divorce that would be, given Willa's suspended status and what would have appeared to be a history of professional misconduct, significantly unfavorable to her. It had been a plan. It had been Rosalie's plan. Now I need to tell you about the building on Aldgate Road, because this is the part that Rosalie did not know. In 2017, I sold my appraisal firm. I sold it for considerably more than I had paid for it, because I had spent 31 years making it worth considerably more. I did not retire to a quiet life. I took the proceeds and on the advice of my accountant and a very good real estate attorney, I invested. Conservatively, she would probably say. Strategically, I would say. One of those investments was a 60% ownership stake in a commercial property on Aldgate Road. The primary tenant of that building for the past 6 years had been a chain of outpatient rehabilitation clinics. The secondary tenant, occupying the ground floor corner suite, was a family law firm. A good one. 11 attorneys, all of them specialists. When I called the managing partner the morning after Owen told Willa he wanted a separation, she already knew my name because we had signed a lease together, and I had sent her a Christmas card every year for 6 years. She picked up on the second ring. I said, I need to refer my daughter. She said, when can she come in? Willa met with them that Thursday. By Friday afternoon, they had sent a letter to Gerald Whitmore informing him that Willa was represented and that all further communications regarding the separation should be directed to their office. By the following Monday, they had filed a motion to freeze the joint accounts pending full financial disclosure. By Wednesday, they had sent a discovery request that included, among other things, a demand for records related to any devices, tablets, phones, computers, owned by members of Owen's immediate family. Rosalie's attorney called Gerald Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore called Owen. Owen called Willa and said, with what she described as genuine bewilderment, who are these attorneys? Willa said, mine. He said, where did you find them? She said, my mother. There was a long pause. Then he said, Lenora doesn't know anyone in family law. She said, Owen, you don't know very much about my mother. I want to be honest with you about something. When it started to unravel, I felt something I'm not entirely proud of. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was more like the specific cold clarity you feel when something you have known for a long time is finally, irrevocably acknowledged to be true. I didn't want Rosalie to suffer. I didn't want Owen to suffer. I wanted my daughter's life back, and I wanted the 2 grandchildren who had spent 7 days without seeing their grandmother to come back to my kitchen and sit at my table and eat the biscuits I make on Saturday mornings. That is all I wanted. What happened over the following weeks was not something I orchestrated. I want to be clear about that. I made the referral. The attorneys did their jobs. The court did its job. The forensic accountant Willa's attorneys hired found, and the financial disclosure, evidence of transfers from the joint account in the months preceding the separation. Transfers that had gone to a holding account that Owen had not voluntarily disclosed. The discovery request for device records turned up Rosalie's tablet. Her attorney fought the subpoena. The judge disagreed. I was not in the room when the IT forensics report came back. Willa called me. She said, "Mom," just that at first. Then she said, it was her. It was her tablet. They can prove it. I sat down. I had known it. I had believed it for months. But knowing and hearing are 2 separate things. And I sat there in my kitchen for a moment and felt very tired, and then very clear. Rosalie's attorney negotiated. That is a polite word for what happened. What happened was that the alternative to negotiating was a criminal referral for fraud and defamation, and whatever her other qualities. Rosalie Drexler was not a woman who would survive the dissolution of her reputation in the community she had built for 40 years. She negotiated. The terms were not mine to dictate. They were Willa's. I made that clear to everyone involved. This was my daughter's life, her marriage, her children. She was the one who had to decide what she could live with. What she decided, she did not want to pursue criminal charges. She wanted Owen to understand fully what his mother had done, and she wanted that understanding to come from him without her having to perform it. She wanted the financial settlement to reflect the disruption to her career and the documented misconduct. She wanted regular, uninterrupted time with her children on a schedule that could not be altered at Owen's convenience or his mother's. She got all 3. Owen, to his credit, and I do give him credit, limited as it is, did not try to defend his mother once the evidence was in front of him. He sat in a room with those documents and he read them, and he went very quiet, and then he said to Willa, according to her, "I didn't know." She said, "I know you didn't know, but I also need you to understand that not knowing isn't the same as nothing. You were used, and so was I, and our kids were in the middle of it." He said, "I know." She said, "I need you to actually know." He said he did. They are not reconciling. I don't think either of them wants that, but they are, cautiously, finding a way to be decent to one another for Scout and Poppy's sake, and that is more than I expected, and more than Rosalie's plan ever would have allowed. Rosalie moved to be closer to her sister in another state. The Fenner Avenue deal did not close on time. I don't know what she told her buyer. I didn't ask. Last Saturday I made biscuits. Scout ate 4. Poppy fell asleep on the couch with her shoes still on, and I covered her with the blanket I've kept on that couch since Willa was small, and I stood there in my living room for a moment in the quiet of the afternoon, and I thought about the night my daughter called me and said, "Mom, I didn't do this." I never doubted her. Not for 1 second. That is not a thing I say to make myself sound noble. It is just the truth. I know my daughter. I raised her, and one of the things I gave her, I hope, is the understanding that when someone tells you I didn't do this, you decide right then, in that moment, whether you are going to stand in their corner or stand somewhere else. I decided 31 years ago, I would stand in her corner, every single time. If you are listening to this and someone is trying to make you feel like the evidence is against you, like the people around you don't believe you, like you have already lost, I want you to hear me say, keep your records. Know who your real advocates are, and do not let someone else's careful plan convince you that you have no options. You have options. You just may not know yet who is standing in your corner. I knew. I was always going to show up. I thought a lot about what made Rosalie believe her plan would work. She's not a foolish woman. She's methodical, patient, and she understood people well enough to manipulate them for years without leaving obvious fingerprints. What she miscalculated wasn't my resources or my professional history. What she miscalculated was simpler than that. She assumed I was the kind of mother who would watch and worry and wait to see how things turned out. She confused age with passivity. She confused quiet with weakness. A lot of people make that mistake. The truth is that the older I've gotten, the less I feel the need to announce what I'm capable of. When I was younger, I think I wanted people to know. I wanted the room to understand what I had built, what I knew, what I could do. That fades. By the time you're past 60, if you've done anything worth doing, you just do the thing. You don't explain yourself first. Rosalie built her plan on a series of small cruelties, each one deniable on its own. The rearranged seating at Poppy's birthday, the calls to Owen about Willa's ambition, the anonymous complaint that was just real enough to sting. Each piece was calculated to isolate my daughter from her job, from her confidence, from her husband, from her children's daily life. What strikes me, looking back at it now, is not how sophisticated it was. It's how much sustained intention it required. She spent months engineering a situation that would leave Willa with nothing. That is not the behavior of a woman who made a mistake. That is the behavior of a woman who made a choice, repeatedly, over a long period of time, and choices over time accumulate into character. Her choices accumulated into something that could not survive the light. I don't think she ever stopped to ask herself what she was teaching Owen, or what Owen, watching his mother operate this way his entire life, had absorbed without knowing it. The way he changed that account password 3 days before he told Willa he wanted a separation. The way he had already spoken to an attorney before he said a word to his wife. He didn't think of those things as betrayals. He thought of them as being prepared. That's what he'd been taught preparation looked like. Willa knew, before the forensic report came back, what the answer was going to be. I think she had known for a long time, in the way you know things you aren't ready yet to say out loud. And I think what she needed, more than evidence, more than attorneys, more than my involvement in any practical sense, was one person who looked her in the eyes and said, "I believe you," not once. Every single time she needed to hear it. That's what I could give her that no building and no legal contact could replace. The resolution of a thing like this doesn't arrive the way you imagine it will. There's no single moment where the wrongdoer is confronted and the truth rings out clearly. What actually happens is slower and quieter. Documents get reviewed, attorneys send letters, mediators sit in rooms. And one day, you realize the plan that was supposed to break your daughter has instead, through the very thoroughness of its documentation, the very precision of its timing, the very confidence of its author, handed you everything you needed to dismantle it completely. I think about Scout and Poppy eating biscuits at my table on Saturday mornings, and I think, that is what integrity costs. It costs the willingness to stay clear when things are deliberately made murky. It costs the discipline to do nothing dramatic when drama is exactly what the other side wants. It costs the patience to let the truth emerge in its own form in its own time, through proper channels without you having to perform your righteousness in public. Willa earned her life back, not because I intervened, because she didn't collapse. She stayed steady inside the storm. That is the only thing I ever really tried to teach her, and I am proud beyond words that she held on to it when it mattered.